Okay, I think we are live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to my channel. For those new here, my name's Nikki. I generally post here on YouTube about writing, reading, some of my editing tips. I'm a freelance editor, but I've also recently started this new series of vlogs once a month on language learning. So, for those of you who missed the first one, I currently study 8 foreign languages. Some of those I started way back in high school, and a couple I've just picked up in the last sort of 18 months or so. So they're all at various levels. Obviously, the couple I started in high school are more in an advanced stage, a few in intermediate, and the rest I'm a beginner. So I'm certainly by no means fluent in all of them, but it's one of those ongoing processes. So because I've recently gotten back into my language learning in a fairly heavy way compared to the bits and pieces I was doing before, I wanted to share some of my thoughts with you. So, just to give a bit of an intro to what we'll talk about today, um, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of language learning, and this is aimed at people who are interested in starting a new language, whether it's the first foreign language you're picking up or another one, having studied one at school or done some study previously. From there, we're going to move on to choosing the language. What's a good reason to study a language? What kind of motivation do you need? And then we'll look at different study methods briefly before thinking about finding resources and working out how to progress from there. So, without any further ado, let's just move straight on to the first obvious question, I guess, which is choosing a language. So, how do you decide which language you're going to pick? Let me just get rid of this banner because it's bugging me. There we go. I think really it's a case of the language picks you in many situations. Some of the sort of obvious reasons, I guess, for choosing a particular language would be perhaps you have family who came from that country, who emigrated maybe to an English-speaking country, and your grandparents' parents still speak their original language, but you've never learnt. And so that's a great reason to pick up the language, just to connect with your roots. Maybe you've met someone romantically, or even just as a friend who comes from another country and you'd like to get to know their culture and their language a little bit better. Or perhaps you've just come into contact with the culture of that country, whether you've visited, whether you enjoy watching their movies, reading books from that country, and you'd like to be able to enjoy these things in the original version without the subtitles. And that's another equally valid reason to learn a language. And finally, maybe you've just heard the language and you love the sound of it and you're fascinated by the idea of it and how it works. And again, that's a good reason. One thing I have seen about motivation, there's lots of people here on YouTube who speak about language learning. And one of the common themes when talking about motivation seems to be the fact that motivation can change over time. So perhaps when you first started learning Japanese, you did it because you love anime. And that's great. But once you've hit that initial kind of plateau in the language learning, you need something a bit more than that to keep you going with the language and to keep you progressing and wanting to continue studying it. And that's when you start to have to reassess your motivation and perhaps find some sub motivations, if you like, some other reasons to continue it as well. But certainly when choosing a language, you've got that initial impact of, is perhaps you want to learn to speak to a family member, to a new boyfriend, to enjoy movies in that language without subtitles. Another thing to consider, though, is also what resources are available for that language. I know from personal experience, one language that I will talk about in more detail in a future video that I've been studying is Icelandic. And I came to Icelandic because of an interest in Vikings. Not so much born from the Vikings TV series, but just in general, I'm a bit of a history buff too. And I was reading a lot of the old Icelandic sagas, the medieval works, and I was really fascinated with the idea of being able to read them in the original. And so I started learning Icelandic. I had a friend in Iceland, a pen pal, so I had the option to practice reading and writing a little bit. But Icelandic is not a popular language, at least not for English based language learners. I imagine it possibly there's more resources if you are a Danish, perhaps Swedish speaker, but certainly for English to Icelandic, there's not a huge amount out there. I found a wonderful website that I believe the Icelandic government is involved in running, which is a kind of Icelandic course for foreigners. And that was really great. But the trouble was, once I'd finished that, going through that course, I wasn't getting enough opportunity to use and practice Icelandic. My pen pal was only writing rarely. Maybe I'd write to her once or twice a year. And in between those letters, I'd forget a lot. And it was hard to find other ways to practice. I watched an occasional Icelandic film or TV series that became available to watch here, but there's not a huge amount. Whereas, say, something like French or German or Japanese, there's a ton of resources everywhere. There are plenty of YouTubers, blogs, you name it, masses of books. So that is also something to consider. Obviously, if you have contact as a family member or friend with a native speaker, that's going to help because you've got that regular input, that regular chance to practice. But if you're choosing a language that you're just interested in, then having a little look first to see how many resources are going to be available and how easy it's going to be to pursue these studies is also something that's worth considering, because you don't want to invest a lot of time and money and only to hit a complete road hump right in the middle of your studies. So just something to keep in mind when you're choosing a language. So let's say we've now chosen our language. So let's move on to study methods. This is going to be one of those topics where it's not a one size fits all kind of scenario. When I started learning foreign languages, my first exposure at all to foreign languages was not until the first year of high school, when we took compulsory language studies. In my case, it was French and German that we did first. I started with German, then moved on to French. And a classroom setting may be the best option for some. I certainly got on fine with it when I started language learning. I took to languages quite quickly. I did very well in my language studies through high school. And certainly at that stage, it worked for me because I was new to them. I was new to both the languages I was studying. So I was at the same level as everyone with the class. And although I did progress a little bit faster, in general, my teachers were willing to help me at the end of class for 5 minutes if I had a question about something a bit more advanced. And I had a lot of input in the languages outside of school as well, because I love musical theatre and I also love reading. So I was able to start trying to read a little bit in those languages, and I was listening to songs, to musical theatre songs, and singing along in those languages. So it was all additional practice and getting to have a slightly more advanced understanding of the language outside of class. However, one thing I found as I've gotten older is that now I study languages mostly independently. Italian, I did pick up a bit at school first, but Czech, Danish, Icelandic, Japanese, so far they have all been self-taught. I've done one or two little MOOCs, which are, of those who don't know, it means a massive open online course, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. They're generally free courses. And I have done a few of those, but it's still been by myself, independent study. One thing I'm doing now with Korean is I started Korean as independent study, but I am now taking some classes as well. They're free Zoom classes once a week. And I found those really enjoyable on one level because it gives me an opportunity to practice speaking. I don't have any Korean friends in the vicinity, only online. So that class is my only opportunity to practice speaking and to get my speaking heard and assessed by a native speaker, at present anyway. So I'm really enjoying that, and it's a chance to revise some stuff that I've already been studying by myself. However, at the same time, in this class, we're all at very different levels. Some of us have already studied a lot on our own and perhaps have studied other languages as well. Whereas some people, for some of the other class members, it's their first foreign language and the class lessons are their only study. So that makes the class situation a little bit more difficult because we are at very different levels. I'd be willing to progress a lot faster, whereas there are some people in the class who struggle a little bit more to keep up. So whether a class situation is right for you is going to depend on your background, whether you've done any independent study first. Certainly if you have, you might want to look at perhaps starting at a second level class rather than the beginners one, um, to make sure that you're not bored and you're not sitting there thinking that you know all this already. But at the same time, if you're someone who needs motivation to study, then a class environment could be really good for you because you have the other people around you to encourage you. The teachers are likely to set homework or assignments, which will just get you studying if perhaps you need that little boost. Whereas if you're someone like me who's really enjoys studying and is happy just to set aside time and do it just off their own bat, then you might find it's fine to self-study and to use resources online. Uh, Again, it's very much a personal thing, and you'll see loads of language polyglot YouTubers on here, and each of them will talk about their own methods and what works best for them. But at the end of the day, it's going to be very much an individual thing, and what works for one person might not work for another. And it's going to be a case of trying these things out, maybe attending a class, seeing how it goes. And if that's not working for you, you can move to independent study, or vice versa. Have a go at independent study, but then if you feel you need a bit more structure, you could look at taking a class. So there's so many options out there, and just Googling, looking at some advice from other language speakers, speakers of your language, or just polyglots in general. Just look at all the different methods they suggest and give them all a go until you find what works for you. And once you find what works for you, then stick with it. That's the one. That's the one that's for you. That's the golden one, if you like. I mentioned earlier MOOCs, so I should maybe mention MOOCs because I think MOOCs are kind of the in between in many ways between those two versions. You're not attending a class physically or online, really, where you're getting in the moment tuition, if you like. So, massive open online courses are generally recorded video lectures, perhaps accompanied by some quizzes, some assignments. And there are various websites that offer these. The ones I've used myself are Coursera, edX, and FutureLearn. Probably are the main ones. There's also Udemy and um, a handful of others, but those three I mentioned first, Coursera, edX, and FutureLearn, are ones I use regularly. In general, these MOOCs are available for free if you just audit the course. And what I mean by that is you are able to watch the video materials, perhaps do some of the exercises, but you won't be able to do the final assessment to get the certificate. If you want a certificate to show at the end of it, then you'll have to pay a fee for that. But just to go through the course in your own time, at your own pace, is usually free. Some of them you can access the entire course in advance. Others, they release bits week by week. It will just depend on the individual course. But generally, if you happen to be free at 7 in the morning, you can do it then. If you prefer evening study, you can fit it in then. That makes it really handy because unlike other classes where you're attending in person or at Zoom at a particular time, if something comes up, you're not going to miss class. You can just catch up another day. You can find MOOCs for quite a few languages, to be honest. There's plenty for Chinese. There's a few around for Japanese, Korean. There's usually a few about as well for French, German, Italian, I've seen. So it's worth taking a look and seeing. And I haven't put those links to those websites I mentioned in the description at the moment, but I will go back and add them later on for you. So that's something worth considering because that is kind of the middle ground between self-study and a classroom environment. If you kind of think you need a little bit of structure, but you don't want to be tied down to the same time every week. So moving on from there, I guess, one thing I will mention before I leave study methods actually is that study methods can change over time. I learned languages initially in the way I learned them at school. Now, I guess there are two approaches you could consider main approaches to language study. The first one is topic-based. Now, my sister at her high school learnt French in a topic-based manner. So she would be given a topic, they'd learn all the vocab, they'd learn some phrases, perhaps a little bit of grammar. They'd be tested on it, and then that was it. They'd move on to the next topic, and what they'd just learnt was never covered again. And I went to a grammar school, and our approach was a little bit different. And we didn't learn by topics, we learned by grammar. And We studied different bits of grammar and we learnt vocab and phrases as we were studying the grammar. And our tests generally were not per topic, but just on everything. Every now and again, we'd have a test on everything we'd done so far, and then gradually adding. And this is how I still study languages. I'm a grammar-based learner for certain. When I come to a language, yes, it's nice to learn one or two phrases like hello, how are you, that kind of thing at the start. But I usually jump straight into the grammar. I want to learn how to form present tense, past tense, future tense, at least as an opening. And from there, I keep building on the grammar. And for vocab, it's kind of a learn as you go approach with me. I like that because I find that learning phrases for me personally, it's like, great, I can say that phrase, but I don't understand all the components of the phrase and how it comes together. And I like to have that grammatical and structural understanding of the language first, because once I know that, then theoretically I can build any sentences, and then it's just a matter of slowly adding vocab, adding cultural understanding. But if you learn by phrases, then you can say those phrases, but could you necessarily adapt them into something different? Perhaps not, unless you understood the grammar as well. That being said, though, for me, vocab learning has always been one of the hardest aspects, other than finding speaking practice, though that's something I'll talk about at another time in a little bit. But I'm actually just now attempting a new style of vocab learning, because I've always studied vocab in the way I learned at school, which was basically by vocabulary lists. If I came across a new word, I'd write it down. But I'm finding as I get more advanced in languages, and just in more recent years while I'm learning new ones, that I am not learning vocab as well that way. I'm picking up bits that I hear on, say, K-dramas or in Japanese musical theatre or anime, and I know those words, and sometimes they're really random and perhaps I'd never need to use them. I mean, for example, one of the first things I learned, or some of the first things I learned to say in Japanese were words like contract, soul, and demon, because one of my favorite animes and mangas is Black Butler. So it's really great that I know all these words like akuma. But in real life situations, will I need to use them very regularly? Probably not. And so what I'm trying, actually I've just started this week, it's really a very new trial, is I'm trying this thing called the gold list method, which I have put a link to below the information that I read about it to find out about it, which is a slightly different style of vocab learning that involves writing phrases and coming back to them at 2-week intervals, rather than keep studying them every day, trying to memorize them. So I'll maybe give you a bit of an update on how that's going in a later video when I see how I get on with it. But as I was saying, the whole point of this long-winded discussion, sorry, I got a little bit off track there, but the whole point was to say that just because a method worked for you once doesn't mean you have to keep that method forever. You may find that over time you want to try something different, and perhaps having a break is a good thing, and trying something new will just give you a bit of a boost, particularly if you're feeling stuck in a language. So from there, let's move on just briefly to think about finding resources. So as I mentioned, this is going to depend a little bit on your study method. If you are taking a structured class, there's likely a recommended textbook or some kind of handouts and things like that that they will give you. But if you are studying independently, or even if you want to do additional study on top of your classes, then you'll be looking for your own resources. The internet has been a real boon in this respect. Certainly things are a lot easier than they were back when I was at high school. We had the internet back when I was at high school. I'm not quite that old, but it was still new enough. I didn't actually get internet at my home. I was still living in my family home through high school and uni. And we didn't actually get the internet on in my house until I started uni. So through high school, I was cut off from the internet for language learning. And these days it's much easier, because a quick Google search will find you an absolute ton of resources, particularly for popular major languages, some of the major European branches, the major Asian ones. So it's a lot easier now, but what sort of resources should you look for? This is an incredibly hard question, and it's going to tie into what we've just been talking about your study methods. because what resources you buy will depend on how you want to learn. It's no use buying a book with sort of topic-based dialogues if you're intending to study grammar first. And there's no point in buying a heavy, stodgy, in-depth grammar book that's really too advanced for you if you think you'll do better learning phrases in different topics and working from there. So taking a look at different resources is going to be a huge part of your language journey. Just to illustrate that, I'll just grab my bullet journal from the side here. Because as I mentioned, this video series started because I've gotten back into language learning in a very heavy way in the last few months. And one thing I have done is, I'll just kind of, you don't need to see in detail, but I'll just hold up here. So I've been through and looked online, found some resources, both YouTube channels and websites, apps that are relevant for the languages I'm learning. I've basically written them all down in here, and I can't look at them all at once. This is something we'll discuss a little bit more in next month's video when I talk about pitfalls in language learning. But I'm gradually going to take a look at them just one at a time, assess them, see what ones I think are going to be useful for me. If they are useful, I'll work through them. If they're not, I can take them off the list. So there really is so much now. And I mentioned Icelandic earlier, which I had trouble finding resources for when I first started. And it's still not, definitely not. I mean, my list for Icelandic, for example, has 6 websites to review on. However, if I flick to another page, for Japanese, say, so this whole bit here is potential Japanese websites. So you can see there's quite a difference still. However, there is a little bit more than there was before. I found a really fun YouTube channel that's called Icelandic for Foreigners, and I'm working through the videos there. So it does vary over time, and obviously the more I guess the more highly spoken languages, you're going to find a lot more resources for. So a Google search is a great place to start. You'll find some YouTube channels where native speakers or even just advanced second language speakers will offer tutorials, perhaps conversations in slow versions of your language. There are plenty of those out there on YouTube. And you'll find blogs again with articles that maybe talk about grammar, talk about idioms, different cultural aspects of the language. Another great resource, of course, these days are podcasts and also things like Netflix. Netflix has a huge amount of foreign language content. I'm addicted to K-dramas on Netflix myself, as well as watching some anime and such on there. And an advantage with Netflix is that you can get these extensions for Chrome called Language Learning with Netflix, which allows you to view subtitles in both your language and the original language, and it gives you some additional sort of language learning materials. So you can watch the show just watching it on Netflix, or you can really get into in-depth language study with it these days. Other than that, you might want to consider books. Now, I'm a fairly large advocate of books, I would say. I have textbooks for all my language, or perhaps textbooks the wrong word. I don't tend to buy the textbooks that you'd follow in classes, but I always buy for all my languages, a dictionary if one's available. Sometimes for some languages that's harder than others. I buy a book about verbs with verb tables if that's available. I buy at least one, if not more, grammar references depending on the language. And then sometimes I'll buy extra books. For example, for Japanese and Korean, I have some bilingual readers. So they're short stories in each of the languages with English versions and information about the grammar and the words and things like that. So as a beginner to intermediate learner, those kind of things are quite helpful too, to get you started reading before you're ready to tackle full texts. So there are plenty of resources out there. Another resource aspect I want to talk about is speaking. Now, for all my languages, speaking is generally the one I practice the least. I have the least opportunity to do so. But again, the internet and modern life gives us new options. We don't necessarily have to travel to the countries anymore. We don't have to know native speakers in our neighborhood, because there are websites like HelloTalk and italki where you can have text conversations or video conversations or lessons with native speakers. Italki, for instance, is one I very much have on my radar. I haven't used it yet, but I've seen so many wonderful reviews of it. And you can book lessons or conversations with native speakers on there, just paying one off by the hour. And I'm looking at that definitely. I'm thinking next year probably, because I'm doing some, I'm focusing my studies elsewhere at the moment for the next few months. But that's definitely something I want to consider next year, to get talking again in some of my languages a bit more. So there's so much out there. As I said, watch some other videos, and just a quick look on YouTube. If you search learn French and things like that, you'll come up with an absolute ton of potential channels. So watch a couple of videos from each one, see which ones appeal to you, which presentation style you like, and take it from there. Next time, as I said, I am going to come back to talking about the pitfalls of language learning, because there are some pitfalls associated with some of these resources, and just with finding resources as well. If you're into music, by the way, one I haven't mentioned is music, of course, in your foreign language, whether it's pop music, musical theatre, opera. But that does have an attendant pitfall, which I will talk about next time. So it's great in some ways, but there are things to be wary of. So after all this discussion, what's left? Now, obviously, this was a really just super quick overview. I mean, you could break down into many more videos. You could do a video just on learning Netflix from YouTube. No, learning languages, sorry, from Netflix, if I get it the right way around. Or study in a classroom versus study independently. I've really just done a very, very brief overview in this video. And if there's a particular aspect that I've talked about that you'd like me to go into more detail on, let me know, and I'll try and incorporate it into a future video. My plans essentially for the next couple of streams are, if I find my list here, oops, go back a page. Okay, so next time we're going to talk about the pitfalls of language learning, and I'm also going to complete the Guilty Language Learner tag. So that should be a bit of fun. And then we're going to talk about fluency and what it really means. I'm then going to have a little chat with you about how I've been studying this year and what my plans are as we move into 2022, because I'm going to make some changes. So I want to think about that. And then I'm going to, I believe at that point, yes, I'm going to start breaking down my language learning into my 8 languages. And I'm going to talk to you about how I got started in those languages, how I've continued my studies, what resources I love, and look at those in a bit more detail, before finally coming back with a few more sort of overview kind of texts towards the end of the series, or at least my initial run of the series. I may extend it if there's more to talk about, but I'm going to give you some anecdotes on my language fails over time and things like that. So, and having fun and just relaxing into it is a huge thing, and which is the final point I'd like to make. Yes, you need to put in time and you need to put in effort. You can't just learn a language without doing anything. You have to study. It's not just as simple as clicking your fingers. So yeah, you have to put the time in, but it can be really rewarding. And I think the way to make it rewarding and to continue with it and keep your motivation is to have fun with it. And that's why choosing the correct study method makes a huge difference, because if you're picking a study method that you're bored with, that it feels like a slog, you're not having fun, then you're less likely to keep the language up and progress. So you've got to find what works for you, what method enables you to remember stuff, what method is the most fun for you as well. It doesn't matter, like you'll see hundreds of videos, people claiming they became fluent in 3 months, which frankly, I would take with a pinch of salt. You might be able to learn enough to go on holiday in 3 months and get by ordering in a restaurant and that, but there's no way in 3 months you can get a complete understanding of a language and a culture. I doubt you can even really do it in a lifetime. Even the languages that I'm in a more advanced stage at, I'm still learning new stuff all the time. So fluency is, as I will talk about in a couple of months' time, something it's an ongoing process. There isn't a moment when you're fluent and that's it. You don't need to study anymore. But having fun is the most important thing. It doesn't matter if it takes you a year to become confident enough to have a conversation with someone. It doesn't matter if you do it in 2 months. It's got to be the speed that works for you, and you've got to be enjoying yourself to want to continue it. So, on that note, I will close, but I will be back again next month when, as I said, I'm going to talk about some of the pitfalls and hopefully how to avoid some of them, or at least how to get around them if you fall into them. And I'll be back in the meantime, obviously, before then as well, with my end of the month reading and TV and film watching wrap ups. So I hope you will join me for those. But for now, bye everyone, and I hope to see you again soon.